Now, we're constantly told by politicians that small businesses are the backbone of the American economy. And by federal law, the government is required to give 23% of contracts to small businesses. But the reality is that the system has been rigged. Just between 2012 and 2013, over 200 Fortune 500 companies were the ones receiving these federal small business contracts. And this problem has existed for years, but is it being addressed? Joining us now is Lloyd Chapman, the president and founder of the American Small Business League. And over the phone, we have Charles Tiefer, a professor at the University of Baltimore Law School. So, gentlemen, thank you both for joining me. And Charles, why don't we start with you, because you recently wrote up a report about this that's up the university, or you wrote this for the University of Baltimore Law School, and you looked into this issue and you said that really there's fraud happening here. So break it down for us as to the ways in which these contracts end up in the hands of Fortune 500 companies.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be with you, Alma. A big company that has, sometimes they're enormous. It can be like General Dynamics or Raytheon or Northrop Grumman, that has a desire to get one of these lucrative contracts, but it's going to federal contracts, but it's going to go to a small business, has ways of acquiring the small business, or at least acquiring a share of it, or having the small business give it the work, or have entities in between it and the small business, sort of that look like a buffer. A big company that's a federal contractor sometimes can be desperate to grow its business, and getting its hands on a small business contract looks awfully tempting to it.
I can imagine so. And so, Lloyd, basically, what has the response been from the government? Because this is not the first time that people have been pointing out that these small business contracts are ending up in the wrong hands. The government is missing their mark when it comes to meeting that 23% threshold. And what have they been saying all along?
Well, for over a decade, they've said that it's anomalies. So every day for over 10 years, the biggest companies in the world have gotten federal small business contracts. For example, last year, I think General Dynamics got $215 million. Verizon's been getting small business contracts for a decade, and they say it's due to anomalies and miscoding. But anomalies would be a random occurrence with a random pattern of distribution where an equal number of contracts that were miscoded as where a large corporation would get a small business contract, we offset by a small business getting a large business contract. We don't see that. And the SBA press office for a decade has said, this is a myth. They said it's anomalies. The current head of the SBA press office, Terry Sutherland, has actually refused to comment to any journalist for a number of months. But it's clearly not anomalies. In fact, the truth about this comes from people like Professor Tiefer, from the SBA Inspector General, from the GAO. They say it's fraud, it's illegal. Nothing in federal law would allow the government to include contracts for Fortune 500 firms as small business contracts. Yet it's gone on every year for a decade. And I've written a bill in Congress called H.R. 1622, the Fairness and Transparency in Contracting Act. I've introduced it to Congress 3 times, and it's never made it out of committee. So when people in Washington talk about jobs, the facts are that the Census Bureau says that small businesses create over 90% of the net new jobs. And the 23% small business contracting program is actually the largest economic stimulus program in history to direct infrastructure spending to the middle class. And yet the program's been hijacked by Fortune 500 firms, and no legislation's been passed, no policies were adopted. In 2008, President Obama even released a statement that said that it's time in the diversion of federal small business contracts to corporate giants. And yet it continues. So it's time for somebody in government, for Congress or the Justice Department, to step in, look at this issue, and in the fraud, because it is fraud. And again, that's what Professor Tiefer's opinion shows. That's what the SBA's own Inspector General has said, and that's what the Government Accounting Office has said.
And by the way, I've got the release that's pulled up with this report that the American Small Business League has put out, and you just look at the names of some of these companies, and it's mind-blowing. They certainly are not small businesses when you see Chevron, Apple, General Electric, AT&T, CVS, Hewlett-Packard, Verizon, Costco, Bank of America, Home Depot. It just keeps going and going. And so, Professor Tiefer, in your mind, Why is it that we haven't seen any kind of legislation? Why is it that the Small Business Administration hasn't taken this on? Is it just that they don't have the time, that they think that these are anomalies, or is there something more sinister at play?
The SBA is very heavily lobbied, very heavily pressured by the business community, and so when one specific reform that would have made quite a difference, which was to require repeated certifications, recertifications by small businesses that were holding a contract, that they were still small businesses, meaning that they hadn't made one of these ties by which the value of the contract is siphoned off by a large business. When the SBA proposed something like this, it was hit by a tidal wave of pressure from those holding the contracts, which would include those who shouldn't be holding the contracts, like large businesses. And they backed off in the way of this. And that was pretty much taught the Obama administration this was back in its first term, to leave hands off, to leave well enough alone, and not to try to put reforms through.
So once again, we see the pressure from big industries winning out here. Now, Lloyd, there are some new bills that are being brought up in Congress. For example, there's one that's trying to raise the percentage of the goal for federal contracts that are given to small businesses from 23 to 25%. And if you look at some of the latest news reports, they'll tell you that this year, according to the data that the government has put online publicly, that for the first time, the government is set to meet that 23% mark. So what's your response to things like this?
Well, I like to just stick to the facts. And the fact is that no federal law would allow the inclusion of Fortune 500 firms in the 23% goal. So when the government says they're going to hit the 23% goal, they're doing two things. The real federal acquisition budget is $1.1 trillion, which Professor Tiefer states in his legal opinion. They use a number that's half of that, less than half of that, which is around $500 billion. The other thing they do is include thousands of large corporations, Fortune 500 firms, overseas companies. So in reality, small businesses are getting maybe 5%. So for the government to claim that they're hitting the 3% goal is laughable when you include Fortune 500 firms. And there's no question, this is not an opinion. Anyone can go to the Federal Procurement Data System and look at the data, and it clearly shows that there are hundreds of Fortune 500 firms, foreign-owned companies, Rolls-Royce, British Aerospace, even a Russian-owned arms dealer got small business contracts a few years ago. Roseboard Exports, the New York Times wrote a story about that. But again, the facts come from people like Professor Tiefer, the SBA Inspector General, the Government Accountability Office, and the misinformation comes from the SBA Press Office and people like Terry Sutherland that keep telling people that the government's hitting the goal, and that's just a lie. It's not true. And no investigation by either the media or any federal investigator has ever found that they're hitting the goal. It's never happened. So every investigation has found fraud for a decade. And Professor Tiefer's right. It's the Fortune 500 firms controlling the SBA. Think of the lunacy of that, of Fortune 500 firms controlling the Small Business Administration. That's like letting Al Qaeda control, the Homeland Security.
If I can speak to the 23% figure, it's 23%, but it should be 23% of the entire flow of contracting money by the federal government, but it isn't. Things like enormous programs like Medicare and Medicaid, which pay out their money to hospitals and to drug companies, those payments to those companies are not counted as to what the 23% is supposed to be 23% of, so that the actual flow of federal money to contractors is, who knows, half the 23% it's supposed to be if you count all these other programs.
All right, well, I have to leave it there, but Professor Tiefer and Lloyd Chapman, thank you both so much for joining us today. And again, we have that information in our resource well, too, so people can see the facts and what's really going on here. Thanks.
Thank you, Loma.
Thank you.